Ages rolled away until they attained their consummation in this, the Lord of days, the day whereon the day star of the Bahá'í manifested itself above the horizon of mercy, the day in which the beauty of the all-glorious shone forth in the exalted person of Ali Muhammad, the Bab. No sooner did he reveal himself than all the people rose up against him. By some he was denounced as one that have uttered slanders against God, the Almighty, the Ancient of Days. Others regard him as a man smitten with madness, an allegation which I myself have heard from the lips of the one of the divines. Still others disputed his claim to be the mouthpiece of God, and stigmatized him as one who had stolen and used as his the words of the Almighty, who had perverted their meaning and mingled them with his own. The eye of grandeur weepeth sore for the things which their mouths have uttered, while they continue rejoice upon their seats. God said, is my witness, O people, I am come to you with a revelation from the Lord, your God, the Lord of your fathers of old. Look not, O people, at the things ye possess. Look rather at the things God hath sent down unto you. This surely will be better for you than the whole of creation, could ye but perceive it. Repeat the gaze, O people, and consider the testimony of God, and his proof which are in your possession, and compare them unto the revelation sent down unto you in this day, that the truth, the infallible truth, may be indubitably manifested unto you. Follow not, O people, the steps of the evil one. Follow ye the faith of the all-merciful, and be ye of them that truly believe. What will profit man if he were to fail to recognize the revelation of God? Nothing whatever. To this mine own self, the omnipotent, the omniscient, the all-wise, will testify. The more he exhorted them, the fiercer grew their enmity, till at the last they put him to death with shameful cruelty. The curse of God be upon the oppressors. Baha'u'llah.
It's so wonderful to be here and be able to talk with you about the person and the mission of the Bab. What we're going to talk about today is the person and the mission of the Bab. If I look to the left a little bit, my left, it's because I'm using two computer screens right now. And so I'm looking at the screen when I do that. Okay, so let's begin. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the person of the Bab, who he was, and his mission. And this will include presenting insights from his important place in history and an overview of what his teachings were. Just for everyone's clarity, this presentation is presented from the point of view of the Baha'i Faith, what the Baha'i Faith says about the Bab. And the assertions made in this presentation, to the best of my ability, will be historically accurate and representative of the Baha'i teachings. Of course, any errors that are made are my own, but I will attempt to do this to the best of my ability. Okay, so we'll go through this quickly. This was the first screen, which I mentioned the title, The Mission of the Bab. And I already covered this. Okay, so here we were. I was just mentioning that these are the 3 books that I have shared with the world so far, and that they're available on Amazon for anyone that's interested. So working on the gate was a wonderful opportunity for me, really an opportunity of a lifetime. And as everyone knows, we had the great challenge of trying to figure out how to tell an interesting and engaging story when you can't show on screen your actual main character. But it took us a couple of years to figure out how to do it. and with the blessings of the National Spiritual Assembly and in consultation with the Universal House of Justice, we were able to bring this film to the world. And we brought it out in 2018. Okay, so let's get right into our content today, the Bob's place in history. So the Bob launched a new world religion in 1844, along with Baha'u'llah. And he was opposed and persecuted by the clergy and the government of that era. The Baha'i Faith has grown despite this opposition and difficulty to over 5 million followers in over 200 countries. So it's really quite a remarkable story of how the faith has managed to accomplish so much in such a short period of time. So the Bob's place in history is very interesting. So this is a timeline of history. It is drawn to scale, and where the arrows land on the timeline is pretty close to exactly where the manifestations of God, the divine educators, show up on the timeline of history. So you see that going back a little bit more than 5,000 years, every now and then, 500 to 1,000 years approximately, God chooses to send a divine educator to humanity. And you see way over here on the right-hand side of the screen that the Bab and Baha'u'llah are literally the most recent of the divine educators sent to humanity. So here's a very, very powerful comment made by Shoghi Effendi on the 100th anniversary of the martyrdom of the Bab, and that would have been in 1950 is that year of that anniversary. And the Baha'is were gathered at the Baha'i Temple in Illinois. And this is what Shoghi Effendi had to say to those people about the Bab's place in history at that time. He said, "Moved to share with assembled representatives of American Baha'i community gathered beneath the dome of the most holy house of worship in the Baha'i world, feelings of profound emotion evoked by this historic occasion of the worldwide commemoration of the first centenary of the martyrdom of the Blessed Bab, prophet and herald of the faith of Baha'u'llah, founder of the dispensation and marking the culmination of the 6,000-year-old Adamic cycle, inaugurator of the 5,000 century Baha'i cycle." So this is what he told the representatives at the house of worship on the 100th anniversary of the martyrdom of the Bab. So we can isolate 4 main points, 4 features from this statement. The Bab was most definitely the forerunner of Baha'u'llah. He was a full manifestation of God or divine educator in his own right, an independent prophet of God. He was the terminator of the 6,000-year-old Adamic cycle. And that Adamic cycle included all the messengers of God I showed you a moment ago. And that he was also the inaugurator of the 5,000 century Baha'i cycle. So let's take a look at this from a graphical presentation point of view. So according to the Baha'i teachings, the 6,000-year cycle of prophecy, which began with Adam, ended with the Bab. Muhammad actually was the last of the prophets if we understand the statement to be in the context of the ending of the prophetic cycle. He was the last one of that cycle. And then you see the Bab at the pivot point to the new age. So this particular drawing was not drawn to scale, but it is still representative of the of the process that took place over the last 6,000 years. Now, all of that 6,000 years is that little graphic on the left, and we're going to see a 500,000 year cycle that is just at the very beginning stages. How about that? So you see the Bab is the pivot point in history for the ending of the Adamic cycle and the inauguration or the beginning of the prophetic cycle of history. Baha'u'llah too is also referred to as the inaugurator of the fulfillment cycle because he is the first manifestation of God fully in the age of fulfillment. Also, please note that the goal of the Baha'i Faith, which is the most great peace, the purpose for which Baha'u'llah came into the world in the first place, is expected to be accomplished during the golden age of the Baha'i Faith. So that means at a future, but within the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, the promised age of universal peace, spiritual awakening for humanity will occur. And that really is something that takes place at the very beginning of this, or near to the very beginning of this 500,000 year cycle. And so what comes after that is really unimaginable to us in our generation, but it's going to be quite something wonderful for humanity. And of course, according to the Baha'i teachings and the Bab's teachings, there will be many messengers of God yet to come in the future. Now, this graphic is to show you what it looks like when you draw it to scale. I thought I'd try to put the 506,000 years altogether on a 12-inch ruler scale. And you see that orange area to the that tiny little orange area to the left of the ruler, representing maybe about an eighth of an inch on the ruler. That's all of recorded history. 6,000 years of human history is represented in that tiny little orange area. And the resolution of the graph is zoomed out so much that the Bab and Baha'u'llah and all of us appear to be virtually at the same spot on the line of history. That's how close we are when you look at this matter from the point of view of drawing it to scale. And the blue area will be the 500,000 years that have just begun. So we are at the end of the beginning of history and the beginning of the middle of human history. That's a way I like to say it anyway. So this is something to give us tremendous perspective about the importance of the age in which we are living, really setting the foundation for ages and millennia yet to come. So in my own journey in the Baha'i Faith, I had wonderful Baha'i teachers, but for most of my Baha'i life, I only thought of the Bab as the forerunner of Baha'u'llah. But as we saw in the quote before, there's these other characteristics that are of great importance. So the Guardian actually makes a claim about the significance of the Bab station and what is the real basis for his claim to greatness. So let's take a look at that. He says the greatness of the Bab consists primarily not in his being the divinely appointed forerunner of so transcendent a revelation, but rather in his having been invested with the powers inherent in the inaugurator of a separate religious dispensation, and in his wielding to a degree unrivaled by the messengers gone before him, the scepter of independent prophethood. So when I eventually came across this quotation from Chogyam Effendi in his book, The World Order of Baha'u'llah, I was taken aback. I said, everything I thought I understood about the Bab, I didn't actually quite understand about the Bab properly. And that of course, he is the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, but so much more as well. And it's so interesting. What is this phrase, wielding the scepter of independent prophethood to a degree unrivaled? What does that mean? So I'm going to offer you just one way. There's numerous ways to interpret this. I'm just going to give you one example. So this is so interesting, but I think when we consider the sheer quantity of the Bab's revelation, this will help us to get an understanding of this unusual statement, the scepter of independent prophethood to a degree unrivaled by the messengers of the past. So here's a little chart I made up for everyone. So the Bab makes a really interesting statement in the Persian Bayan, one of his major works. He makes this remark that by that point in history, he had revealed 500,000 verses. And this was within about 2 years remaining in his ministry. So we can do some math. We can do some calculations here. So if you look at this table, the Bab's output by Maku was 500,000, and it took him about 4 years of his ministry to achieve that. So if you do the math, it comes to 125,000 verses per year on average, and that translates into 342 verses per day. Now, I'm not saying he did it literally every day, the same number of verses. I'm just using averages here to get perspective. Okay. So the Old Testament, by contrast, is only the entire Old Testament is 23,145 verses. It took humanity about 1,000 years to pull it together, multiple authors. And you do the math again, that comes to about 23 verses per year, or 0.06 verses per day. For the New Testament, we see 7,957 verses, and it translates to how much time they had to do it, roughly about 80 verses per year, or 0.2 verses per day. And the Quran, which is where I'm going to make my main comparison, was 6,236 verses. It took Muhammad 22 years to reveal it, and that gives Muhammad a pace of 283 verses per year, or 0.78 verses per day. Now, over here on the right-hand column, we have the Bab's rate of production was X times faster than the earlier revelations. So the Bab was 5,000 times more productive in sheer volume of revelation, 5,401, compared to the revelation of the Old Testament. He was 1,571 times more rapid than the New Testament. And with regard to the Quran, he was 441 times faster. So now the Bab had 4 years to do his work. Muhammad had 22 years to do his. So when you do it on a verses per day, you can do a fair comparison. Now, it's also very important to remember that looking at this quantification in any way doesn't say the Bab is a superior manifestation to any of the others, or it's not a claim to superiority. It's just a simple quantitative statement of how much did he reveal, and what is a possible meaning of Shoghi Effendi's statement that the Bab wielded the scepter of prophecy to a degree unrivaled by any messengers of the past. Of course, if Moses had been sent at the time of the Bab, he would have done what the Bab did, or vice versa. So it's not a comparison of merit, they're all divine messengers. But it was the time in history for the Bab to reveal a tremendous quantity of material for our age. And Baha'u'llah followed up by doing much the same. I just think it's a fascinating way to look at what the Bab's achievement was. So when we think about the role of the forerunner and the role of the manifestation of God, we realize that these two things go hand in hand. Each is a support of the other, not one, not the other, but they're both going hand in hand. Let's talk about the story of the Bab. So the Bab was born in Shiraz, Persia, 1819, which is Iran today, to a very highly respected family of merchants. The Bab showed unusual spiritual receptivity and spiritual gifts from his earliest age, and he had no education to speak of. There's the famous story of the Bab being sent to school by his uncle, and his instructor, who was a man by the name of Sheikh Abid, after a little while brought the little boy back to his family and said, I really am not qualified to teach this one. You take care of him, but keep him safe. That's it. And as is covered in my first volume on the Bab, I found out subsequent history what happened to Sheikh Abid, and at a later time, Sheikh Abid has a very dramatic conversion, and he becomes a follower of the Bab, which this is not told in Dawnbreakers, but it's in my book, which is a fun thing to mention. So in 1844, the Bab declared his mission as the divine messenger, the promised one of Islam and of all the faiths. He did that in the upper room of his home with Mullah Hussein, as all of the Baha'is are well aware and well familiar with this dramatic and powerful story. As we noted a moment ago, the Bab's revelatory output, just in sheer quantity, was literally astounding. Humanity had never seen anything like this before. But it wasn't just the quantity that was impressive. It was the actual revelation itself that literally, when the words were read and the groups of people meeting in those days and the people hearing it in the original language, they were literally reduced to tears and overcome with emotion. So powerful were the words revealed by the Bab. So as we know, the cause grew. The growth was stunning for its time. Really, we could say that the growth of the Babi movement in its time was explosive in the cultural scene in 19th century Persia. And this prompted, or you might say provoked, tremendous opposition, violent opposition by both the clergy and the government. The Bab was exiled repeatedly, first from Shiraz, then to Isfahan, then to the fortress at Maku, and then again to the fortress in Chirik, and finally he was imprisoned just before his martyrdom in Tabriz. The slaughtering that took place against the Babis was horrific. More than 20,000 of the followers were killed, but they willingly sacrificed their lives because of their determined conviction in the mission and station of the Bab. He was put through a phony trial in Tabriz while he was still a prisoner at Tarik. And then finally in July of 1850, there's the really astounding and wonderful and amazing story of the martyrdom of the Bab in July of 1850 in the barracks square of Tabriz. I'm not going to include that story in today's talk, but if we get into it in the question and answer period, that will be fine. So the Bab was able to excite the people of Persia because he fulfilled their millennial expectations. There was millennial fervor going on in the Western world at the same time, and this led people of both East and the West to be searching for the imminent appearance of the Promised One. The people in the East were the lucky ones. They got to actually meet and encounter the Bab, and he fulfilled not only the prophecies of the Bible, and he also fulfilled the prophecies of Islam concerning the appearance of their Promised One. As mentioned before, the Bab foretold the coming of him whom God shall make manifest, who nobody knew who that was in his time, but we now know today from our perspective in the 21st century that that was Baha'u'llah, the glory of God 1817 to 1892. The Baha'u'llah had been one of the foremost followers of the Bab in that period. What's really, really interesting is the manner in which the Baha'i faith, the Bahá'í Faith evolved into the Baha'i Faith. It was very much a result of the Bab's leadership, but no less, it was a result of the leadership of Baha'u'llah. Here's something astounding to mention. For the first time in history, when a manifestation of God or a divine educator is preparing the way for the one yet to come, 99% of the followers of the Bab became Baha'is. This is the reason why there's no significant Bahá'í faith in the world today, because the Babis chose to become Baha'is. So the Bahá'í faith essentially vanished, which is what the Bab wished it would do, because he wanted everybody to accept Baha'u'llah, whom he was preparing them for. So this achievement of 99% of the Babis becoming Baha'is is truly a momentous, it's a first in history. It is truly a historic achievement that the Baha'i faith can make a claim to. And then, of course, the faith continued its growth and development with the ministries of Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and today with the Universal House of Justice. So now this severely persecuted, almost to the point of extinction, movement has spread all over the planet to over 200 countries and encompassing somewhere between 5 to 7 million followers around the world. So the Bab prepared the people for the coming of Baha'u'llah, and he taught many profound teachings that are well suited for the modern age in which we are living. So let's talk about the teachings of the Bab. It's really wonderful to think about the teachings of the Bab taken as a whole. My understanding of the teachings of the Bab are basically dependent on two sources. Of course, the writings of the Bab himself. We have beautiful translation of some of his words in selections from the writings of the Bab, published by the Universal House of Justice. And also we have brilliant scholars of the faith. The one that I consider personally, in my opinion, the leading scholar is Dr. Nader Saidi at UCLA. And Dr. Saidi wrote this wonderful book called Gate of the Heart, which is about the writings of the Bab. And I rely extensively on learning about the teachings of the Bab through Dr. Saidi's work. And side note, I got to work closely with Dr. Saidi during the period of time that we were producing the film, The Gate. He's wonderful to work with, by the way. Anyway, moving on. So the teachings of the Bab, the foundation of everything in his thought world is the pure oneness of God. Everything in the Bab's teaching, and frankly in the Baha'i teachings as well, begins with the monotheistic, there is only one God point of view. I refer to it as a mature monotheism because when you see the way the Bab talks and then later Baha'u'llah talk about the oneness of God, you see that it's free from any forms of superstition or human anthropomorphism. And so the Bab describes the God in truly infinite and all-encompassing terms. And it's very important to note that this is really the foundation of where all of his teachings come from. So when you describe the oneness of God in terms of the absolute infinity of God, which is what the Bab does, this has a very cleansing effect in terms of how an individual will understand the nature of God. We realize that we're just ants trying to understand a mighty being. We are incapable of understanding God directly, so we have to get our understanding through the revealed words of the divine educators. This helps us to sweep away the anthropomorphism that humanity has grown so accustomed to, And it largely sets aside man-made constructs and regarding the concept of God. If we're all basically helpless to understand God, except for what he chooses to tell us through revelation, then what are we fighting about? It's so wonderful. It just clears away any motivation to get into any form of strife over, I believe this about God, you believe that about God. It just has this wonderful cleansing effect when you understand the oneness of God from the perspective of the Bab and also of Baha'u'llah. So Bab spoke of the primal will of God as emanating out from God, the source. This is just a symbolic representation of what that looks like. So God is the source, can be compared like the sun, and the primal will can be compared to be like the rays of the sun. The manifestation of God is a glorious mirror reflecting the rays of the sun, which is another term for the Holy Spirit. And then here we are down on planet Earth, just living our lives, trying to get the benefit of God's revelation. And so any brownie points for anyone who can tell me what city that is. Anyway, just for fun. It's my hometown, Boston. Anyway, so all of the divine educators are the same, spiritually, they're same. They're individuals, they're different individuals, but they're the same spiritually. They are all reflecting the same light of God. And so this station of being a perfect mirror of the attributes of God is universal. Krishna, Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, Baha'u'llah, future manifestations, and also numerous manifestations of God in the past whose names have been lost to history. The Bab says that the manifestations of God are innumerable throughout history. We only know the names of some of them. So it's a wonderful exercise to try to imagine who else might be on the list, but these are the names that we have to work with. By the way, if anybody is a careful observer here, you see before you in this graphic a portrayal of the Trinity, the concept of the Trinity that Abdul Baha explains. The Father is like the sun in the sky, the rays of the sun are like the Holy Spirit, and the Son of God is the mirror, but where the Baha'i take on it is so unique and different is we don't believe that the mirror has shown up in history only one time. It has shown up in history many times, and many times more yet to come. Anyway, so this is the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit right here on this graphic, if you are a careful observer. Okay, so here is a quote from the Bab, taken from selections from the writings of the Bab, where he specifically talks about how the primal will of God appears in the manifestations of God throughout history. He mentions Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. He mentions himself, the Bab. He mentions him whom God shall make manifest, which we now know is Baha'u'llah. You can read the quote. And notice very, very precisely, he says, what shineth resplendent in each one of them hath been and will ever remain one and the same sun. So from a Baha'is perspective, as Baha'u'llah mentions in the Book of Certitude, no distinction do we make between any of God's messengers. None of them are superior or better than the other. They each came with a revelation for the time in which they appeared, and the rays, the holy rays of the Holy Spirit are shining in each and every one of them. It's the same sun. Okay. So the Bab's presentation of the unity of religion included the idea that the divine educators are all manifestations of the primal will. They're from the same God. They are the true source of knowledge of God. He sends them into the world whenever and wherever he's pleased to do so. And, oh, please, he says, don't be fighting with one another about this. So The Bab does speak about the unity of the divine educators. I just wanted to share with you this graphic, just as a way of representing that they're all sent by the same God. My fun PowerPoint animations. Now, it's interesting, it's human beings, not God, who have caused these divisions throughout history. The religions are intended to be chapters in one underlying revelation unfolding through the ages. So we actually realize that the divine educators are members of one, like a school faculty. If they are the educators and all of creation is a classroom, which is a theme I discuss in my books, then they're all on the same faculty. And they all, try to have a fantasy moment where you imagine all of the teachers meeting together in the teacher's lounge up in heaven somewhere. And they're all bantering about and talking with one another, getting along with each other just fine. And then the principal sends the assignment, oh, it's 1844, Bob, it's time for you to go. 2,000 years ago, Jesus, it's your turn to go. But they're all on the same team. It's one faculty of the university or the school of God. So these divine educators, they're all praising one another, they're admiring one another, they're acknowledging one another, they're sacrificing for one another. They are absolutely adoring friends, colleagues, participants in the same story with one another, but they each are different in that they show up in different times in history and they give the lessons that humanity needs at that time. Once you wrap your mind around this framework and you realize this is completely consistent with the scriptures of the past, not the dogmas of the theologians, but the scriptures of the past, you realize that this recognition of unity induces in us human beings compassion, affection, and of crucial importance, reconciliation among the followers of the religions of the world. There's absolutely nothing to be fighting about. We should be loving and admiring the divine educators whenever they appear in history. Another one of the Bab's important teachings was the perspective of unity. I'm not going to read all of this word for word. It's up on the screen for you to look at. I'm going to talk about the quote at the bottom here. He says, within the inmost reality of all things, there hath been and will forever continue to be a sign from God through which the unity of the Lord is celebrated. This sign is a reflection of his will, present within it, through which is seen but God. So all things in creation are reflections of the signs of the will of God. So we look at each other, we look at the creation, and what we are supposed to see is the reflections of God in each and everything and each and every one of us. So this perspective of unity, according to Dr. Nader Saidi, transforms all of reality into mirrors reflecting the divine names in every possible form and all of their glory. So when you process this understanding of the teaching of the Bab, what is the perspective of unity, you begin to realize from a mystical and a spiritual perspective, there can only be, and there only is, one human race. It's impossible to see it any other way. All people are created by God's will, regardless of the outward differences. In fact, the fullness of God's unity is demonstrated on the earthly plane by the near infinite diversity of the human race. Therefore, the logical outcome of the perspective of unity is the oneness of humanity and the embrace of the principle of the unity through diversity. Does that make sense? So in our infinitely diverse forms, all of us are reflections of the same light of God. because in the Bab's thought universe, there's only one God, so naturally all the light comes from the same source. So all of us, all things are united as recipients of his light. Humanity is one because we are all mirrors reflecting the same light of God. This is providing the logical, the spiritual rationale for what Baha'u'llah will later clearly articulate as the principle of the oneness of humanity. This gives all of the spiritual, the intellectual, and even the mystical underpinning for why that belief is true in the first place. So this is a wonderful quote from the Bab that foreshadows Baha'u'llah's teaching of the oneness of mankind. He urges the believers to become as true brethren in the one and indivisible religion of God, free from distinction, for verily God desireth that your hearts should become mirrors unto your brethren in the faith, so that ye find yourselves reflected in them and they in you. This is the true path of God the Almighty, and he is indeed watchful over your actions. So this is the practical application of the perspective of unity, which the Bab and subsequently also Baha'u'llah has given us for this day. And the more you ponder it, I think the more inspiring and the more uplifting each person will find this principle. So we're going to move on to some other teachings. One of the Bab's most important teachings is the path to guidance is one of love and compassion, not of force and coercion. This hath been God's method in the past and shall continue to be in the future. So the Bab has prohibited aggression. He allowed self-defense in that stage of history, but he prohibited aggression and coercion. And this goes very far towards eliminating disunity in the human race. Be as peaceful as you possibly can be, is what the Bab wanted for all of us. The Bab also gave teachings about dissolving intolerance. And this is actually one of my favorite quotes, translated and published in Dr. Saidi's book. And I just have to read it to you in full, because I think the way he speaks is so wonderful. He's talking about two people who are having an argument about God. Thus these two would dispute. This one saith, thou art an extremist. And the other one saith, thou art intolerant. This one adduceth evidence from a word of God, and that one reasoneth by another word of God. But I affirm unto them, ye are both true and right, on the condition that thou not say unto him, he is an extremist, and he not say unto thee, thou art intolerant. Thus, wert thou to acquire wisdom, thou wouldst not reject anyone because of his limitation, but must foster the growth of all in the palm of thy mercy. Shouldst thou succeed in elevating him to the realm of glory, great would be his blessing from thee. And should he fail to ascend to thy height, thou shouldst train him within his own rank of existence. For he, verily, he too is a creation of thy Lord. God loveth him, and he loveth God. Continuing with the teachings, the Bab discouraged talk of miracles. He actually referred to it as asking for miracles is a sign of immaturity. And he's very direct about this. He says, he who recounteth any miracle other than the verses is veiled from any truth. Not just most truth or some truth, any truth. So we don't try to prove in this day the truth of God's revelation by resort to miracles. It's been ruled out. Dr. Saidi commented in his book, in this new age, the Bab explains, physical miracles are no longer the conclusive testimony of the prophet. Those who ask for miracles are merely testifying to the immaturity of their own spiritual level. So what this accomplishes for the human condition is it makes religion far more rational, less superstitious, and more compatible with science and modernity. This absolutely promotes unity in the modern age. This abandonment of miracles as a proof. Actually, you might recall in the time of his trial, when he was in Tabriz on trial in front of the mullahs of the day and the crown prince of the realm, he was asked to perform a miracle. And he said in reply, "My miracle has already been performed. It is the same as the Prophet Muhammad, the revelation of the divine verses." That was his reply. So the Bab also taught search for truth. He says, "Beseech thou God to open through his grace the gate of the heart unto thee." And there's another quote here you can look at. This is very, very interesting. The ethical standard established by the Bab is truly impressive. It goes very far, in my opinion, beyond the simple golden rule, which of course is quite wonderful, but he actually taught the believers to engage in whatever they did from the point of view of purity of motive. So he taught them, he said, no behavior turns into a real action unless you say these words: "Verily, I do this for God, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of all that is seen and unseen, the Lord of creation." So here's something interesting. Think if you were obligated to say this verse, even if only in your own thoughts, anytime you did any action, how many people would be engaging in selfish or evil conduct if they had to think about this each and every time they took an action? Now, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes, and some people are just rotten, but not too many. But overall, the vast impact on human civilization, how wonderful it would be for humanity that whenever we thought something, our thoughts were elevated by the need to say, "I do this for God." What an elevation to our ethical standard we would all experience. Now, this principle of purity of motive applies equally to the worship one undertakes to God. That which is worthy of essence is to worship him for his sake, without fear of fire or hope of paradise. Although when true worship is offered, the worshiper is delivered from the fire, such should not be the motive for his act. So it's wonderful that we get into the paradise of God because we worship properly and we do good deeds, but our motives should be purely for the sake of God, and our actions should be, "I do this for God." Very, very interesting how the Bab has really given us a next stage beyond the golden rule. The Bab gave his followers the guidance. He says, "I want you to bring joy to other people. Not just do unto them the way they do unto you." That's wonderful. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying beyond, better than that, more than that, I want you to bring joy to other people. But wait, if you can't do that for whatever reason, at least don't bring them grief and sorrow and pain. Do your best, to the best of your ability. Bring joy to the hearts. At least, if you can't do that, refrain from causing other people grief through the things that you do. And this also translates into another principle, which can be referred to as the responsibility to elevate, or to educate and elevate other people. The Bab says, whoever possesses any power over anything at all must elevate that to the uttermost perfection, so that it may not be deprived of its own paradise. He even goes so far as to say that if you fail to do this, if you fail to elevate something when you had the opportunity to do so and the means to do so, he would be held accountable. Oh my goodness, he would be held accountable. So it's not just a favor to someone. We actually have a moral responsibility to be elevating one another to the best of our ability, to empower one another, to strengthen one another, to bring joy to one another. And if we don't do it, we're actually going to be held accountable. So that's something definitely to think about. And he puts the question very plainly, why hast thou, despite the possession of the means, withheld the effusion of grace and favor? Why would you do that? Okay, we're nearly at the conclusion here. So here's an overview of the teachings of the Bab, which we've touched on. The unity and infinity of God. The Bab embraced education in the arts and sciences as well as religion. He took tremendous steps to elevate the status of women. He taught us to independently search for truth. He gave us a truly exalted standard of conduct. He rejected miracles as proofs. He defined heaven and hell as conditions of the soul, not as physical places. He referred to paradise as perfection, attaining perfection. He taught that resurrection is renewal. He taught non-aggression, purity of deeds and purity of worship. He taught us a spiritualization of our perspective on reality, to see the reflection of God in all things. He taught us to view the unity of religion and to view religion inclusively. And when you put it all together, and this is only some of the teachings of the Bab, it's not the whole picture. It's just what I could fit into this time frame to talk about. When you put these all together, you see all of these teachings attack the root problems of humanity, which is unity. Each and every one of these things has a unifying and uplifting effect when they're implemented. So they get right to the root of the modern problems of humanity. And you can also see, today we're just talking about the Bab, but if we were to do a chapter 2 and do a talk about the person and mission of Baha'u'llah, you would see that everything that the Bab did sets the stage and prepares the way for the further work that Baha'u'llah was going to do a little later on, not very long after, but soon after. So it's very, very interesting how that is all tied together. The manifestation of God, the forerunner, these are intimately connected with one another. So some final thoughts and conclusions. In 1844, the Bab was the co-founder of the youngest of the world religions, Bahá'í Faith. His mission was to launch a new stage in human history and prepare the followers for the coming of Baha'u'llah. His unifying revelation is well suited to the needs of the modern age, which has a primary illness of disunity. He wielded the scepter of independent prophethood to a degree unrivaled from the messengers of the past, while at the same time he exalted and testified to the greatness of all the messengers which preceded him. He was magnificently successful in preparing the Babis to embrace Baha'u'llah. And then with Baha'u'llah, the Bab was a superb exemplar of his own teachings. He truly did, if we had had more time and told stories about the Bab, he actually truly practiced what he preached. He was a very noble exemplar of his teachings and the love and unity which he promoted. By the way, can anybody identify what the background for the slides were? I took the photo of the slide it's the side of the shrine of the Bab. We've been looking at the shrine of the Bab the whole time, just for fun. So thank you, everyone. I put my contact information up here I'll leave it up on the screen for a couple of moments. And if anybody wishes to contact me, ask a question, you can argue with me if you want. You can point out a mistake I made if I made any. Whatever you want, I'd be happy to hear from anyone if you have something you want to discuss. So there's my contact information. I can put it up again later, but I think I'll stop sharing the screen and give the floor back to Paymene. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about one of my truly favorite subjects in the whole world. By writing books and doing the film, I truly have fallen in love with the Bab over and over again in these last several years. And it's one of my favorite things in all is to talk about the Bab. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Price, for this really amazing presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to share all of that expertise with us. So if you have a question, you can just put it in the chat and we will have some time to answer them. Okay, so the first question is, what is the meaning of Bab or the Bab?
The word Bab is simply gate or door. And so the Bab is the gate or the doorway to a figure yet to come, which Abdu'l-Baha explains, the writings explain that he was the Bab, meaning the gate, was the doorway or the opening to the coming of Baha'u'llah, whom he referred to as him whom God shall make manifest. The word Bab also has historic meaning within Islam. So it has multiple layers. In Islamic history, there was a split between the Sunni followers and the Shiite followers. The Shiites had figures, leaders that they called imams. The son-in-law of Muhammad, whose name was Ali, was the first of the imams. And according to Shiite history, there are different parts of Shiism. I'm going to make this extremely simple. There's 12 imams which followed Muhammad, beginning with Ali. And then in about the year 874, this line of succession, they were all family members of the Prophet Muhammad. And the 12th imam disappeared. And there followed some people that were known as gates. They were called Babs, but they were gates to the hidden imam. So that went on for a period of time, and then eventually that stopped as well. And literally the 12th imam was viewed as being in hiding for about 1,000 years. So the Bab was the return of the 12th imam within the Islamic theology. And so when the Bab first made his claim, when he first, Sayyid Ali Muhammad was his name. And when he first claimed to be the Bab, the Islamic community thought that he was talking about being a gate to the hidden imam, or the hidden imam. It turns out that he was much more than that. He was actually the return of the hidden imam himself, and more important even than that, he was the forerunner of Baha'u'llah. So it has these multiple levels of meaning, but from a Baha'i perspective, the central meaning is that he was the gate to the new age, to the coming of Baha'u'llah.
Great, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, what is the real name of Baha'u'llah, and at what age did he claim to be a prophet?
So Baha'u'llah was Mirza Hussein Ali. He was a nobleman in his home region was around Tehran in the northern provinces of Iran in the 19th century. If you look on at a map, it's generally the Mazandaran province where he lived. Tehran, the city of Tehran, is located there. His father was extremely wealthy and a high-ranking official in the court of the Shah at the time. So Baha'u'llah and his family were all considered nobility in the country. Baha'u'llah made his claim known in 1863, and he was born in 1817. So we need to do the math. And pulled up my little calculator. 1863 minus 1817. That would have made him 46 years old approximately when he declared his mission in Baghdad, when he was being exiled from Baghdad on his way to Constantinople. Now, when I do that calculation, I'm doing it in solar years. The Islamic calendar is lunar, so the number would be slightly different.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please explain the martyrdom of the Bab and its relevance and connotations to Islamic history and writings?
I'm not sure I can answer the second part of the question, but I can briefly describe what happened on that day in July 9th, 1850. The Bab had been in prison. He'd gone through the mock trial, and there had been a great deal of upheaval in the country in the 2 years preceding. That's when the Battle of Fort Tabarsi took place and other upheavals throughout the country. And the prime minister, it was a new prime minister, because the old previous Shah had died. The new prime minister took it upon himself that we have to get rid of this problem of these Babis. And they decided at that time, the prime minister decided at that time to order the execution of the Bab. Now, the Bab was at the time imprisoned in the northwestern corner of Persia, which is the province of Azerbaijan, and the city in the fortress of Churik. He was brought from the fortress to Tabriz for a second and final time. Actually, I should say a third and final time. And on July the 9th, they signed his death warrant. And this was a major social event at the time. There was a big public square referred to as a barracks square because it was a military gathering place. And the Bab was brought to this square, and there were people watching this from the rooftops all over the square. Altogether, there were about 10,000 witnesses to this event. There were also there were representatives from other governments at the time, the British and the Russian and the Turkish empires and governments at the time, and there were journalists present as well. And then the Bab had been in his prison cell just off of the barrack square when the guard came to take him. And the Bab said, and the guard said, "It's time for you to come." And the Bab said, "I'm giving some final instructions to my secretary, and you're not going to be able to do anything to me. No power on earth can prevent me from completing to the last word my intentions." the guard brought him. But before this had even occurred, there was a strange circumstance with the captain of the Armenian regiment that had been assigned for the execution. His name was Sam Khan, and he had an order from the prime minister to execute the Bab, but he didn't want to do it. He had reasons to believe that the Bab was a holy man, and I can talk about that separately if someone wants me to. He didn't want to kill the Bab, even though he had orders to do so. So he spoke to the Bab earlier in the morning, and the Bab told him, follow your orders, and if your intention is sincere, the Almighty will surely relieve you of your perplexity. Okay, so back to the moment when the guard comes to take the Bab. The Bab makes his statement that you can't stop me from finishing my instructions to my secretary. The guard says it's time for you to come, and they take him out. They string him up, and there was a disciple of the Bab that had begged permission to be martyred with him that day. So the Bab and his disciple Anis were strung up in front of the multitude. The regiment was 750 soldiers. Some historical accounts say the number was larger than that. I'm actually using the conservative number that Nabil uses in the Dawnbreakers. And they were arranged in 3 ranks of 250. You might recall that the technology, the rifle technology in the 19th century was not our modern technology, it was muskets. And so these weapons produced a tremendous amount of smoke. And so the order was given just at about a little bit before noontime. And the first volley of 250 was fired. The second volley of 250 was fired. The third volley of 250 was fired. The smoke was of such magnitude that no one could see anything. It just filled the square with so much smoke. But eventually, with the air, the breeze moved the smoke out of the square. And when the smoke cleared, the body of the Bab was nowhere to be seen. The disciple, Anis, was standing there unharmed, and the Bab himself was nowhere, not there. He was gone. So this led to a frantic search for the whereabouts of the Bab. Where did he go? What had just happened? The crowd went crazy. They were declaring a miracle had occurred, and the search for the Bab began. It didn't actually take them long to find him. He was back in his cell, finishing his conversation with his secretary as he promised that he would do. And at this point, Sam Khan had his perplexity resolved. He was no longer wondering what he should do. And he ordered his men, his 750 soldiers, to leave the barrack square. And he said, I've done my job, I did it, and I'm not doing it again. And off he went. And that's the last we hear of Sam Khan, as far as I know. But the orders were that it was necessary for him to be shot, so they had found him again. And so another regiment, this time it was a Muslim regiment, and they strung him up again with the disciple, and they repeated the procedure, 250, 250, 250. Again, the smoke cleared, filled the square. And when the smoke did clear, the Bab had been executed. But very, very strangely, the bullets had not made any impact on his face. And there seemed to be a serene expression on his face. The military authorities ordered that the body of the Bab be thrown into the moat outside the city. It was their hope that the remains of the body would be devoured by the wild animals out there in the wilderness outside the city. And the remains of the Bab were left there for the remainder of the day. And with the body of the disciple and the body of the Bab had been melded together from the force of the bullets. And late that night, through a very audacious plan, the Babis that were there in the city managed to rescue the Bab's body, and the remains of the Bab's body were, the Bab and his disciple were kept hidden for 59 years. Of course, in the meantime, the clergy declared, yay, it had been devoured by the animals, and they proclaimed their victory. But 59 years later, after being hidden in various places, the remains of the body of the remains of the Bab and his disciple were brought to the Holy Land. And during the ministry of Abdul Baha, I forget the exact year, I want to say around 1908, 1909, the remains of the Bab were interred in the shrine of the Bab, where they will remain forever and be protected as the holy shrine for the Baha'is of the world today. Abdul Baha had constructed this shrine, and Shugh Effendi further finished the work, and we have the beautiful golden dome of the shrine of the Bab today as a holy place of pilgrimage for the Baha'is all over the world. So that was this incredible story of how the Bab was martyred on July the 9th, 1850, and the subsequent, what happened after that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
For sharing that. And just to address a few questions, Abdul Baha was the son of Baha'u'llah.
Correct.
And Shoghi Effendi was the grandson of Abdul, so the great grandson of Baha'u'llah.
The grandson of Abdul Baha, yes.
Okay, next question. Can you please, if possible, explain how you transformed from being an atheist?
Oh, well, I was raised in a Jewish family, but we were more secular than devout. We had the Passover Seder in our family tradition, but it was more custom than belief. And as a young man, as a boy, I was sent to Hebrew school. My parents thought they were doing the right thing, and from their perspective, they were trying to give me a religious education. But to be honest with you, I hated every minute of it. It was an awful experience. And they sent me to Hebrew school, but they didn't even teach us Hebrew. It was ridiculous. I mean, please don't misunderstand my personal experience as in any kind of disrespect to Judaism as a whole. I'm just explaining what it was like for me as a young boy. And I've grown later to love Judaism, but not at that time in my life. Anyway, I hope everybody understands that. That's important. But anyway, I hated every minute of it. I didn't want to be a part of it. And the closer I got to my bar mitzvah, the less I believed any of it. Out of obligation, my parents told me I had to do a bar mitzvah. So when I was 13 in 1967, I did my bar mitzvah. But literally that was the last day I set foot in a house of worship until 5 years later. So from the age of 13 to the age of 18, I went through junior high school and high school as an atheist. I just didn't believe in God at all. And I was much more enamored with science and evolution, and those were my passions at the time. And then I got to go to college at the University of Virginia after high school. And in my first year in college, I met a woman. Her name was Mary. And Mary was a very unusual woman from my perspective. She was remarkable in her character. She was radiant in her personality. She was smart as anything you could imagine. She was really brilliant. And we became friends. We were not a romantic couple. We were not a thing, but we became good friends. And we used to spend time together in the student lounge in the dormitory, studying for exams together. I was taking chemistry and doing badly at it. She was taking English courses and doing great. So she was a lot smarter at that time than I was. Anyway, we would spend the night in the, studying. And then when the early morning hours came, we would go get some breakfast at the local Denny's restaurant, and we would begin to just have general conversation at that point. And then we would go off each to our separate classes, and that would be that. And so it was during these, mainly these times at breakfast, that I had opportunities to converse with Mary about religion. And of course, my impulse at the time was to attack. I thought religion was stupid at that time, and I would do anything I could to tear it apart. I was actually kind of belligerent and unfriendly at the time. And anyway, Mary's reaction was not to get defensive or sad or upset with me. She would listen actually to what I was complaining about with religion, a variety of complaints that I had back then. And she would go basically, have you thought about, and then she would ask me a question. And Mary had this laser-like intellect where she could zero in on the precise issue that needed to be considered. And invariably, when she said to me, have you thought about such and such, I had to admit I had not. And if I had one characteristic going for me, I'm basically an honest person. And so if I had been pointed out that I hadn't thought about something, I would then go and think about it. And so in this way, without being argumentative or pushy or nasty in any way, she gradually opened my mind. And it was an amazing gift. And she was a brilliant teacher. And then I came into contact with some other Baha'is that she met, in the Charlottesville community, and they were just as brilliant teachers of the faith as she was. So over a period of about 3 or 4 months of this kind of dialogue, this very effective way of dialogue, my thinking was completely turned upside down. I did do some reading as a result. And I actually believed in Baha'u'llah as a messenger of God before I had a firm belief in God himself. So I kind of got to it backwards, but God is merciful and he'll do with us whatever he will do. So that's pretty much my story. There's more to say, but that'll be it for the moment, I think.
Thank you. That was really inspiring. Thanks for sharing that story. Okay, I think maybe we have time for one more question. So
Wonderful.
Our last question is, do Baha'is believe in the Day of Judgment and angels?
The answer is yes, but the understanding is different. So in the previous religions of the world, the way the theologians have talked about the Day of Judgment is it's understood as being a calamitous end of world destruction of everything type of event. This is not the way the Baha'i teachings describe it. Frankly, I don't think it's the way the scriptures describe it either from, the Bible, New Quran. But there is violent and calamitous imagery used in the scriptures. But I don't think Bob and Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha have made it clear that these images are meant to affect our thinking, but they're not to be taken literally. So from the Baha'i point of view, the Day of Judgment becomes whenever a manifestation of God appears in the world, the human being is put to the test. And he or she may be spiritually dead. And if he or she is confronted with the fact that a revelation has occurred, that person should investigate the truth. And if the message is true, we're supposed to accept it and receive the spiritual awakening that comes with that revelation. So the judgment is, how do we perform? How do each and every one of us perform when presented with a claim from a divine messenger? If you assess the situation honorably, without prejudice, without bias, if the person making the religious claim is legit and you accept it, then, quote unquote, the day of judgment for you went well. But if the person making the claim, if you don't embrace a valid claim, then your day of judgment isn't going so well. Simultaneously, there are people in the world who make false claims. So if a false claim comes to your attention, you don't know it's false at first, you have to investigate. So when you investigate, if you, through your powers of discernment, are able to determine that this claim to a divine revelation actually is false, and then you reject it, that's actually a good thing, because God does not want us to embrace false prophets. He warns us in the New Testament against that. So we're supposed to reject the false and embrace the new. So if you reject the false, your judgment is going well. Your judgment day is going well. And if you embrace the true, your judgment, your day of judgment has gone well. So we are tasked with rejecting the false and embracing the true. The thing we should never do is anybody with a legitimate sounding claim should not be rejected out of hand. That's where the pitfalls are, because that's prejudice, that's not going by evidence or investigation or attempting to find out the truth. Now, your investigation takes you where you're going to go, but the most important thing is not to do this knee-jerk, reflexive rejection of a substantive claim. So that's really what the Day of Judgment is about. And when the Day of Judgment is affiliated with the Day of Resurrection, they're kind of the similar names for the same thing. And the Bab specifically, I didn't include it in today's presentation, but the Bab refers to the Day of Judgment as a time of renewal. It is not cataclysmic in the world. The Bab says the Day of Resurrection is a day like unto any other day, on which the sun rises and sets, just like any other day. So that's a really beautiful teaching. The Day of Resurrection, and similarly the Day of Judgment, is a time of renewal. It's the birth of a new revelation, and it is our task to recognize it when it appears and to embrace it and to do our best to promote it and to be servants to it, should a legitimate claim come to your attention. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was a very thorough explanation. Thank you. Okay, well, looks like we are at time. So thank you so much again to Mr. Price for joining us, for giving us that insightful presentation and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it.
Well, I've had a wonderful time, and the questions were wonderful. And it's so nice to see such a a wonderful audience of people, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well. And I hope you drew closer to the Bab as studying these writers has done for me. It's really a tremendous benefit when you understand the Bab and Baha'u'llah so much closer together. So thank you.
Definitely, thank you. So next week, our speakers will be Mr. Earl Reedman and Ms. Sharon O'Toole, and they will be talking about who was Shoghi Effendi. So again, these talks are every Saturday, noon Eastern time. And if you're not on our mailing list, I've put the link to our contact form in the chat so you can be added. So we're just going to close off today with a song about the martyrdom of the Bab.
Tears flowed like rain that night. That night they took his life, and people gathered around to see, had he really died? The stars fell and the angels wept. The earth opened up her side with 750 guns, and on his face a smile, and how they tried to conquer what they could not understand, and how their hearts were blinded, for he was more than a man. He was more than a man. The shots were fired, and when the smoke cleared, none could believe their eyes, for standing there unscathed and unhurt was the Bab's companion alive. The Bab himself had vanished and gone. A frenzied search began, and still there were few to accept or believe that he was more than a man, a man. And how they tried to conquer what they could not understand, and how their hearts were blinded, for he was more than a man. He was more than a man. Shine on your light into the darkest night, and make all these souls take flight with your love. Second time that the shots were fired, darkness obscured the sun. Their bodies shattered, they fell to the ground, and we're blended into one. 10,000 witnesses all gathered to see him die, and lingering there on his beautiful face, the warm embrace of his smile, and how they tried to conquer what they could not understand, and how their hearts were blinded, for he was more than a man. He was more than a man.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next Saturday. Bye.